We are in 1830. The Bourbon Dynasty has been restored for more than a decade now, following the downfall of Napoleon, and France is on the brink of yet another revolution. The King of France knows his people are angry, but in no way quells his efforts to increase absolutism. Instead, he has a plan to distract them. This is the story of how pirates, unpaid debt, and an unpopular king led to the invasion of Algeria. This is the story of the French Conquest of Algeria. This video is part of a multi-channel collaboration called Project Africa. We hope to shed a light on the often overlooked history of the continent of Africa. So if you enjoyed this video and wish to learn more, then make sure to check out the playlist in the description. In the beginning of the 18th century, the might of the Ottomans that had once threatened the very core of the Christian world was long gone, and the empire had started slow decline into becoming the sick man of Europe. And while it still held some influence in northern Africa, the towns of Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli had long become independent in all but name. Without a large, centralized authority, the Berber pirates, which used these towns as bases for their raids, had gained a significant amount of influence. As a result, a wave of slavery and terror had spread throughout the Christian world, as towns from Italy to the Netherlands and even Iceland were raided by these pirates. And while these numbers are still highly debated today, it is estimated that between the 16th and 19th century, up to 1.25 million Europeans were captured and sold as slaves by these Barbary pirates. As such, it's understandable why in 1830 France felt compelled to put an end to the practice once and for all. And you would be excused if you believed that this was their true intentions. But by then, the Berber pirates had suffered a couple of harsh defeats in the hands of the Americans and then the British and Dutch, which led to a drastic reduction in their activities. Furthermore, the ruler of the Regency of Algiers, known as the Dey of Algiers, had agreed to no longer allow the trade of Christian slaves more than a decade prior. And so you start to realize that France's intentions were much more flimsy. You see, the King of France, Charles X, was facing stronger and stronger opposition by the Chamber of Deputies for what they perceived as a shift towards conservatism after he appointed the Prince de Polignac as his prime minister. It's important to note here that Charles X's older brother had been guillotined less than 40 years ago. In an attempt to keep his head on his shoulders while still strengthening his royal power, he decided to distract his people with conquest. And what better place to conquer than the evil pirates that have been enslaving Christians for centuries? The Fan Affair of 1827 became a convenient excuse to do just that. Indeed, in 1789, the newly formed French Republic had brought on credit a large amount of wheat from merchants in Algiers in hope to support Napoleon's ill-fated campaign in Egypt. However, now France was no longer a republic, and so Charles X didn't feel the need to pay those merchants back. The fact that they were Jewish probably didn't help either. These merchants were guaranteed by the Dey of Algiers himself, and so the Dey put further and further pressure on France to pay them. The French sent a diplomat, Pierre Duval, to negotiate with the Dey, but that brought them nowhere, and in April 1827, during a heated debate, the Dey struck Duval with his fly whisk. France's adequate and definitely not overblown response was to initiate a blockade against Algiers, which did nothing more than slight French merchants who could no longer trade, while Barbary pirates were still able to smuggle goods to the city. Finally, in 1830, after the Dey had directed cannon fire towards the ship of a French ambassador, but mostly seeing the growing discontentment of his people towards his rule, Charles X decided that stronger actions were required and decided to order the conquest of Algiers. On May 16, 1830, Amiral Duperré, at the head of a fleet of 600 ships, left the port of Toulon and headed towards Algeria. A month later, General de Bourmont landed with his 34,000 men at the town of Sidi Frege, 20 kilometers west of Algiers. And while the Dey was able to raise an army 45,000 strong, he overestimated his strength and ended up using only half of them. Furthermore, his troops were less organized and poorly equipped compared to their French counterparts. Needless to say, the invasion didn't take long, and the Dey surrendered the city on July 5th and fled to exile in Naples. In less than a month, France had ended the 300 years long rule of the Ottomans over the city. Charles X learned about his victory 4 days later. The great and quick victory that he had hoped for did indeed occur, and as he had hoped for, the victory was wildly popular among his people. What he didn't expect, though, was to end up deposed less than 2 weeks later, following a swift revolution known as the July Revolution. Ironically, the revolution was only so swift because the troops that usually defended Paris were busy taking over Algiers. And so it was his successor, Louis-Philippe Ier, that ended up reaping the rewards of this conquest, bolstering his already wild popularity as he was known as the Citizen King. So much so that despite the anti-colonial sentiments of the now liberal government, one couldn't really overlook the popularity boost it brought them, the definite ending of piracy in the region, and above all, the 55 million francs they had gained for the plunder of Algiers. But while the conquest of Algiers was a relatively easy task, colonizing and pacifying the whole of Algeria would soon become an arduous and bloody undertaking. From the get-go, France antagonized the local population through the sacking of Algiers, despite promises of protecting the liberties, properties, and religious freedoms of the inhabitants. Anti-colonial resistance was only further strengthened by the expulsion of all remnants of Turkish authority, which created a power vacuum in which France's strongest opposition would quickly arise. An opposition they would have to deal with for the next century. Following the July Revolution, General de Bourbon attempted to sail back to France in order to put Charles X back to the throne. But his soldiers, as well as Amiral Duperrey, refused to do so, and de Bourbon fled to exile to be replaced by General Clausel. From there, France started a campaign of restrained occupation that was limited to the coastline, as they were harassed by the local Arab and Berber tribes whenever they tried to push inland. An early example of this was when Clausel took over the town of Médéa, which quickly ended in a forced retreat following constant harassment by the Kabyles, a local Berber tribe, and uprising by the townspeople. Less than a year later, the Kabyles were once more able to harass the French troops into retreating, and were so successful in doing so that the French fled back to Algiers in a disorderly panic. The victory fanned the flames of resistance, which led to numerous attacks against colonial settlements in the following months. However, by then, France had a large financial interest in expanding into Algeria, as they had subsidized European settlements in the region, especially in the soil-rich plain of Metidja, and started to develop their colonial presence by building a local administration and recruiting Zouaves, native auxiliaries to the French forces. And so France couldn't afford to stop expanding, and after a series of appointed and quickly dismissed generals, Louis-Philippe finally appointed the Duke of Rovigo at the end of 1831. With him, France was able to retake the town of Beaune and Bougie, towns which General Clausel had lost due to local Berber resistance. However, his methods were brutal, too brutal, and so he was replaced in 1833 by the Baron de Voirol. Finally, on June 22, 1834, France formally annexed the occupied areas of Algeria, which held 2 million people, or 2/3 of Algeria's population back then. That same year, Voirol was replaced by the Général Drouet d'Erlon, who was made the first governor of French Algeria with the task of dealing with a rising new threat, Abdel-Kader. You see, while the Dey of Algiers and his governors, known as Beys, controlled the coastline and major cities in Algeria, the inland were largely ruled by tribal elders and nobles. One of these nobles was the then 25 years old Abdel-Kader, who was elected emir in 1832 in order to lead a jihad against the French invaders. It's with this title that Abdel-Kader was able to sign a peace treaty with France, which gave him control over the entire province of Oman. The prestige and time that the peace brought him allowed him to strengthen his influence with the numerous tribes of Algeria. This quickly made him a great threat to French hegemony over the region, but d'Erlon did little to stop him. Finally, in 1835, following some altercations with the French over the allegiance of certain tribes, Abdel-Kader ejected the French consul from the town of Mascara, which was a de facto declaration of war. The French and Abdelkader had a couple of bloody but indecisive battles, but eventually the French were forced to retreat as they didn't have enough supplies. During their retreat, Abdelkader attacked them with 20,000 men and successfully routed them at the Battle of Macta, which led to the dismissal of D'Erlon and the reappointment of Clausel. Clausel immediately attempted to counter these successes by leading an attack against Mascara, but Abdelkader had already escaped. In 1836, Clausel occupied Tlemcen, left a small garrison there, and decided to retreat with the remaining troops to focus on taking Constantine, which would end up being yet another disastrous defeat. However, Abdelkader kept harassing the French troops in Tlemcen, and so General Bugeaud, a Napoleon veteran who was used to fighting unconventional wars, was sent to reinforce the garrison. There, he decisively defeated Abdelkader in the Battle of Sikak, which forced him to limit Algerian resistance to guerrilla tactics from now on. On October 1837, France finally took over Constantine. Sure, the town was strategically important, as it was one of the biggest cities in Algeria, and its bay had offered staunch resistance against the French. But above all, King Louis-Philippe was hoping that the victory would give him enough popular support to dissolve the Chamber of Deputies. And at this point, you come to realize that the French conquest of Algeria was more driven by politics than anything else, really. Despite France's victory at Constantine, Abdelkader's guerrilla tactics were inflicting severe losses on France. And so, on May 1837, Bugeaud signed the Treaty of Tafna, which recognized Abdelkader's control over much of the interior of Algeria. Once more, this further bolstered his influence with the local tribes. And when France broke the treaty in late 1939 by marching through a mountain gorge known as the Iron Gates, Abdelkader used this as an excuse to renew calls for jihad. However, by then, the French were no longer messing around and had adopted harsher and more effective tactics implemented by General Bugeaud, who had now been appointed as governor of French Algeria. These tactics took much from Abdelkader's own guerrilla tactics, with an added bonus: a brutal scorched earth policy which devastated the Algerian population. As Bugeaud described, "We fire little gunshot, we burn all douars, all villages, all huts. The enemy flees across, taking his flock." Colonel Montagnac perhaps summarized it best by stating that the purpose of pacification was to destroy everything that crawled at our feet, like dogs. Entire Algerian tribes were, at best, forcefully deported to other places, sometimes as far as Guyana, and at worst entirely massacred, as what happened to the Ouled Ria tribe in June 1845. To avoid the brutality of the French army, the 760 people-strong tribe had taken refuge in the cave of Dara. To smoke them out, Colonel Aimable Pélissier ordered the construction of a large wooden pyre at the entrance of the cave, which burnt throughout the night. The following morning, they found out that all 760 men, women, and child, as well as their livestock, had died. When asked about it, Pélissier replied, "The skin of one of my drums have more value than these 760 people." Eventually, he became a Marshal of France, the highest rank in French military, but not before his army massacred 2,300 Algerians, or 2/3 of the city of Laguat, following its capture in 1852. Following his trip to Algeria, French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville, who once favored the conquest of Algeria, harshly criticized France's brutality by writing, "We make war in a much more barbaric manner than the Arabs themselves. It's on their side that one finds civilization." In total, the French conquest of Algeria, along with the diseases and famines it brought, killed an estimated 15 to 30% of the Algerian population. The French themselves paid a heavy price, as their losses, both civilian and military, neared 500,000. Eventually, Abdelkader was forced to flee to Morocco in the face of growing French involvement in the region, as French troops now amounted 160,000. After a Franco-Moroccan war that lasted less than a dozen days, the Sultan of Morocco outlawed Abdelkader from his entire kingdom, and ultimately he was forced to surrender in 1847. Despite being promised that he could enter exile in the Middle East after he surrendered, France held him captive until 1852, before letting him go to Damascus. There, Abdelkader kept fighting for human rights, and without any resentment to the Christian nations that had destroyed his homeland. He saved the lives of thousands of Christians during the anti-Christian riots of 1860, which had killed 3,000 Christians until then. The act gained him recognition worldwide, including in France, where he received La Légion d'honneur, the highest distinction in France. But that didn't stop France from continuing their expansion of French Algeria, and despite several revolts, including the Mokrani Revolt of 1871, where 250 tribes rose against French rule with an army 200,000 strong, the French kept repressing the locals and pushing on, and eventually, in 1903, France had finally pacified the region. Algeria would only gain its independence almost 60 years later in 1962. But that's a story for another day. I hope you enjoyed this video, my friends. If you did, then I'm sure you will also love VC3's great video on the scramble for Africa, as well as Gipoli's brilliant video on Liberia, America's colony in Africa. I promise that they are worth checking out. As usual, every link is in the description. Well, this was Barris. I will see you soon. But until then, my friends, merde!